I remember when I started playing at NCC in the late 90s, 97, Aravinda was part of NCC. And after 1999, he got dropped after the World Cup, quite unfairly, I think. And he would come and play club cricket. And there were days when he would call up and say, what time's the game starting? We'd say it's starting at 9:30. He said, okay, I'll be there by 10:30. If you're fielding, put in a reserve until I come in. And if you're batting, I'll turn up. And if a wicket falls, I'll walk in. If you were fielding, he'll come in straight from the car park onto the ground in his whites with his sneakers undone. He'd come and stand at first slip, call out to the coach saying, I haven't eaten breakfast today, send me two pastries. He put one pastry in his pocket, munch the other at first slip and just stay there. And then if a catch came towards him, he'd step aside, look at the second slip and go, how old are you? And they'd all be in their early 20s. Said, oh, that's your job to dive and catch it. He'd then go out to bat, and the opposition usually would put their worst bowler on, like all their part-timers. And you could see Aravinda's eyes just glaze over. And he'd be like, oh, what am I doing here? And he'll step out, get out, hit the ball up in there, do whatever, come back and say, what number is Hashan Tilakaratne batting? And we'll go, he's batting number 5 or 6. He say, oh, he won't get out till tomorrow. I'm going home. Call me if you need me. And off he went. But then there were other days when he had something to prove and he was trying to get back into that side because he was really hurt that he was left out. He'd be there before all of us. He'd feel that short leg slip. He'd bowl better than any off-spinner other than Murli. And then when he went out to bat and the opposition made the mistake of putting on one of their best bowlers, of bouncing him a couple of times or making some remark at him, he will score 150 to a 200 in the blink of an eye. And you'd be like, that's genius.
It is an honour to welcome you as the 4th Sri Lankan to be inducted in the ICC Hall of Fame. Though I can't help thinking that if you asked any of the three of us already here, myself, Sangha and Murali, we would all agree that you should have been first. Those are the words of Mahela Jayawardena used in his letter to Aravinda de Silva after the latter was inducted in the ICC Hall of Fame. But you might be thinking, Sangakkara averaged 57.4 in tests, while Aravinda was just a little bit under 43. Mahela scored 11,814 runs. Aravinda only 6,361. Yet these two wonderful modern great players talk about Aravinda as if he was better than both of them. Many, like Mahela, still consider him to be the best batter produced by Sri Lanka. And that is why Nasser Hussain decided to bowl first at the Gabba. And this all, of course, reminds me of Hit Wicket, which is a mobile cricket strategy game that is all about making those tough decisions. Who do you want to send in as an opener when the asking rate is climbing? Do you go for the big hitter or the steady accumulator? Me, I like to throw in someone a little bit unorthodox. A bit of a wild card like the general. That keeps the opposition guessing. And what about the bowling attack? Do you unleash your express pace early or hold back for the death overs? I'm always tempted to bring on a mystery spinner in the middle overs and just try and break a partnership. Hit Wicket puts you in the captain's chair. You draft the squad and select the batting order and even decide when to use those game-changing abilities. Do you burn your 2 times ability to chase down a big total or save it for a critical moment later on? It's strategic, it's addictive, and it's more nerve-wracking than facing a Shoaib Akhtar bouncer. Give it a go. Download Hit Wicket and see if you've got the tactical nous to win. When Aravinda hit 167 against Australia at the Gabba in 1989, he put on a partnership with his teammate Arjuna Rantunga. It was tough going for Arjuna because the pace attack had Jeff Lawson, Merv Hughes, Terry Alderman and Carl Rackerman. When they got back to the dressing room at lunch on day 3, Arjuna asked to see Aravinda's bat. He held it up against his own, convinced there was something different about it. It had to be thicker or wider or springier, because that's the only way he could explain how Aravinda was middling everything while he was struggling so much. Of course, this was partly in jest, but it really showed how his teammates saw Aravinda, someone who could do things that they just could not. From 1984 to 95, Sri Lanka lost a lot. They turned up, they were nice, they smiled, and they showed everyone flashes of brilliance, but no one really took them seriously within cricket. Aravinda, in many ways, kind of embodied that. He was polite to a fault, he was brilliant one day, and a walking wicket another. Of course, his talent was recognised, but he just didn't make the kind of consistent runs that get you considered to be one of the best in the world. And of course, being the best batter in a weak side never really helps that much. Nor did the infrequency in which Sri Lanka played. From 87 to 92, Sri Lanka didn't play a single international game at home, as a civil war raged on their island. By 91, Aravinda had 3 centuries in tests, all away from home. And 2 came against a bowling attack that featured Imran Khan, Wazir Akram and Abdul Qadir in 1985. Aravinda was 20 at that stage. But it was New Zealand that really changed everything. In fact, Kiwis still talk about the time that Aravinda turned up in 91. He scored 493 runs in 5 innings, and it included a knock of 267 in the first match, which he apparently scored hungover on 1 hour of sleep. In fact, we need to tell you this story. The Sri Lanka side were in Auckland for 2 ODIs before the Test series, and he was convinced by his sister, who was living there, to go to bed early and get plenty of rest in preparation for the games. It turned out it did nothing for his performances. He came away with the first ball duck and another single-digit score. So when the team travelled to Wellington for the first Test, and he got the opportunity to go out with some friends after the first day's play, he decided he was going to ditch this early-to-bed stuff. By his own admission, he returned to the hotel with about an hour to go before breakfast. And at the end of that day's play, he had more than 200 runs to his name. In fact, it was the first time he'd scored that many runs in a day in any level of cricket. Aravinda's partying became the stuff of cricketing folklore in the Sri Lankan team. And when he got 96 and 123 in the 3rd Test later in that series, things changed a bit. People started to really notice him. But between 92 and 97, he only went on to make 3 more centuries. He would get starts, look like $1 million, and then he'd get out doing something outrageous. It was almost as if he got bored. He needed some sort of external motivation. He batted with an almost uncontrollably daring approach. And it was exactly the same off the field, where he loved fast cars and partying all the times. His nickname at that point was Mad Max. And it wasn't really a compliment. He was a little bit out of control. He was at best an anti-hero. So even though New Zealand in 1991 should have been his coming out party, weirdly enough, the actual maturation of his batting comes in Kent in 1995 when he was playing some county cricket. Their coach, Darryl Foster, was responsible for bringing him in as a replacement for Carl Hooper. He'd seen him bat in the first Test in Brisbane in 1989. Kent captain Mark Benson once told the cricketer that he got 120 letters, at least, from members criticising this decision. Hooper had been one of the most successful batters in the previous season, and when Aravinda struggled in the preseason and early on, things weren't looking good. But they say that when the sun came out, everything changed. There was no stopping Aravinda. He ended that season as the 3rd highest scorer in the county championship, with 1,661 runs and an average of 59.32. Those included 400s and 2 double centuries, one more than Hooper had managed in his previous season. But perhaps the most memorable innings was the 112 he made in the Benson and Hedges final against Lancashire at Lord's. Kent lost that limited overs cup, but Aravinda was named the player of the match for his audacious century, a knock that many county fans still talk about today. Something about that period in Kent really matured him. He was playing for cash. He had to be successful to be paid. And that seemed to change everything with him, and then eventually everything with Sri Lanka. 1995 was an important year for his team as well. Arjuna, Dilip Mendes, and then later on Dav Watmore have been building a steady, formidable side, with Aravinda kind of at the heart of it. Andrew Fernando's piece on Sri Lanka's unlikely World Cup win in '96 notes how each of the players had a distinct role to play, with detailed instructions from Arjuna. The only player who did not was Aravinda. Everyone within the team was given strict instructions on what to do with anything related to him. Let Aravinda be Aravinda might as well have been their motto. Let him eat what he wants, train how he wants, do what he wants, and if everyone left him alone, he would help Sri Lanka win the World Cup. Arjuna once relayed a story which epitomised the importance of the team management on keeping Aravinda happy and motivated. During the '95 tour of Australia, the Sri Lanka team had to make some long journeys on the bus. Aravinda would get in, he would stick in a cassette of his favourite English songs in the music player, and then he would just go off to his seat. The other players would much rather have listened to Sinhalese songs, but they said nothing, because this was Aravinda and they had their instructions. But of course, they could only be tolerant for so long, So eventually they would buy him a Walkman so that he could listen to his music in private. And remember, this is a time when players weren't earning very much money at all. But Arjuna and his team knew the importance of Aravinda to their plans. And less than a year later, after that century for Ket, Aravinda would make another inter-tournament final. The only difference was this wasn't domestic, it was the World Cup. His performance with the bat was incredible. The odds were stacked heavily against him. Australia were the favourites to win. No one had ever won a World Cup chasing before, or scored 100 while batting in the second innings of a World Cup final. Sri Lanka and Aravinda knocked both of those things off. But of course, that wasn't the only thing he did in that final. He took the wickets of Mike Taylor, Ricky Ponting and Ian Healy. He added a couple of catches as well. It really was just a staggering all-round performance on the biggest of stages for him personally and also his nation. But it's important to note that it wasn't even his best performance of that World Cup. That was probably the innings before against India. A packed Eden Gardens, which people were claiming there was 100,000 inside the ground and another 100,000 all trying to get in. Sri Lanka had shown a preference towards chasing and they were sent into bat. Kalu with Aruna and Sanesh Jayasuriya lasted just 4 deliveries, and so Aravinda walked in with the score on 1 for 2. The most obvious thing to do at that stage is to rebuild, consolidate, knock the ball around for a little. Aravinda batted like he did not know what the score was. He cut, drove, pulled with such ferocity that India just looked completely blown out of the game. They tried to tempt him to play away from his body, but every drive just went off the very center of the bat, piercing the infield of the power play. There was nothing they could do to stop him. And perhaps that was the day he really earned that Mad Max nickname. A lone warrior vigilante fighting for the survival of his team in the only way he understood. Aravinda didn't even get 100 that day. In fact, he didn't even survive till the 15th over of the innings. But by the time he'd finished, he had set the course for Sri Lanka's run to their first ever World Cup final. If the knock in the final was steely, calculated and controlled, the one in the semi was just raw power. So Aravinda's role in Sri Lankan cricket doesn't really change before or after that World Cup. He was already the brightest star there. The difference was he had elevated his team way above their normal level. And now it seemed that he wanted to be in those crunch situations, the knockout games, when it was on the line. Especially when there was an expensive car being awarded for player of the tournament, because he loved those. And to be honest, until the 96 World Cup, there were just whispers of his greatness. But what he did from that moment onwards made it impossible not to consider him one of the greats of his era. 1997 was by far his best year in Tests. Until then, he'd made 800s and 1350s, an average of 35.46. He then hits 700s in that year alone, along with 250s from just 11 Test matches. From 97 to when he retired in 2002, he hit 1200s and 950s, basically reversing his conversion rate from the first half of his career. He found his motivation, and Sri Lanka went from a minnow to a competitive side. They played more at home as well, and suddenly they had this batting weapon. Aravinda's last Test innings actually yielded him a double hundred. But what most people remember is his last international, the 2003 World Cup semi-final against old foes Australia. From the moment that Australian all-rounder Simon O'Donnell said it was a waste of time to give Sri Lanka a test in Australia because there was no way that they could last 5 days, Aravinda had nursed a special corner of vindictiveness for the Australians. He relished the opportunities to make runs against them, averaging 48 against them in ODIs, a full 14 runs more than he did against anyone else. And remember, he played from the mid-80s until 2003. So he played against an Australia who won 3 different World Cups in that period. And he brutalized them. So when he walked out to bat with Sri Lanka 37 for 3 in that semi-final, they were chasing 212 to make it to the final. There was a feeling that it was going to be him or no one. He'd already made a really good 90 against the same opposition earlier in the tournament. He was a little bit rounder at the waist and slower on his feet. But he had that same steady look in his eyes, that determination, that Mad Max glint. But this time, something else got in his way. There was a mix-up with his partner, and instead of having this incredible fairy tale swan song, he would be run out. And who is at fault for this? Kumar Sangakkara, who would take his mantle as the best batter in that side. And in 2003, Australia really didn't know that much about Kumar Sangakkara and what he would become. But they knew enough about Aravinda to be happy he was gone, and they ended up winning that game fairly comfortably. Aravinda was a man who needed the motivation of a big game, an opposition who annoyed him, or a county contract, hell, even a shiny new car for player of the tournament to be his best. But when he found that level, there were few players in the world in his era or in any other that could match what he did. When Aravinda de Silva made his debut for Sri Lanka in 1984, they had not yet won a test, and only 10 ODI wins as well. By the time he retired in 2003, Sri Lanka had won a World Cup and were a force in test matches. It is quite clear that Sri Lanka produced two legends of batting after him. And yet, what does it tell you about Aravinda de Silva, the Mad Max, that they still whisper his name? I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.